If we ever set foot on a planet beyond our own, our robots will certainly arrive there first. They've been seeing and mapping and sensing distant worlds with our most advanced technologies for more than 50 years, giving us a multi-planetary perception well beyond our biological limits. What does it feel like to fully inhabit the artificial mind of such robots on Mars and beyond? I'm Dawn Nakagawa, president of the Berggruen Institute here in Los Angeles, and this is Futurology. As robots step out of the pages of science fiction and into our kitchen, our relationship with these embodied computers will inevitably change. Today, robots are being trained on inconceivable amounts of data to create a detailed model of the world around them. We can trace the origin of these machine learning tools that now enable robotic butlers and Amazon package pickers here on Earth directly back to the rovers that wandered the Moon, Mars, and soon well beyond. How have we prepared such machines to navigate the unknown surface of a planet with no GPS, no magnetic north, no road maps, almost no data at all? Because no one and no thing had been there before. How do we communicate with and learn from them today? What will they tell us tomorrow when they touch down on strange worlds? This is the work of our guest on this episode, Vandi Verma. Verma helps lead the robotics department at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory here in Southern California, where her team imagines, builds, and later steers these robots. Verma holds a doctorate in robotics from Carnegie Mellon University and began her career in the earliest days of efforts to create autonomous vehicles. In this episode, she speaks with Webb, the director of Berggruen Institute's Future Humans program, about what it feels like to become an embodied droid in an unforgiving rock hurtling through space. And now, Vandi Verma and Webb on Futurology. So, Dr. Vandi Verma, welcome. It's so nice to see you.
Well, thanks for having me, and it's great to see you again.
What do you do all day long at NASA?
Yes, so it depends on the time. I do different things. So right now I kind of do work on. I'm a roboticist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I work on the Mars rovers. Sometimes I'm driving them. Sometimes I'm developing new capabilities for the rovers, and also I am the development manager for new technology for future missions at JPL.
I'm so excited to learn more about that. To back up a little bit, I'd love to know the beginnings of your curiosity and how you ended up at NASA. So, could you tell me a little bit about your background and your childhood and what were sources of inspiration for you way back when?
Yeah, I was always fascinated with space. But I remember reading this book, actually, somebody gave me about the solar system and just loving the fact that we knew so much about planets so far out. And I was really intrigued by that. It just seemed so far away. So I, like most kids, I loved it, but never thought I was actually going to work in space. And then eventually found my way I was born in India, and I lived in very many different places in India and went to school there. My dad was in the Air Force, and so I was born in this place called Jamnagar, and moved pretty much every year. So I think I changed 12 schools by the time I was in 12th grade. Lots of very small places that even for India, a lot of people might not know about. And it helped me see just how different places on Earth really are, even in one country from each other. Even the languages was different. And it's kind of like, wow, it feels like a faraway, different type of world.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned all these different kinds of trees that you associated with different places, the 12 moves. And it kind of strikes me, Vandi, that you were a kind of traveler through space and time, and cataloging what seems strange at the time and now seems familiar, which is kind of the same, or is very similar to what you do now, recognizing
an alien terrain and then exploring it and categorizing it, and then eventually being able to pick out different elements that have become familiar to you over time.
It's true. And, it's absolutely true. Like, I think that's something that humans are really good at, this pattern recognition, that you could be put in a whole different world. And it is new and different. And you can, uh, um, say it's sort of like an alien world, essentially. And yet we are able to draw connections to the things we know and how you operate in it. And I think I felt very comfortable because I moved so much. I think every new place I'm in, it very quickly feels like home. Like, because it is, the new place may be the longest I have been in anywhere. And so I do feel similarly about the work too. Mars is a very, I've spent a lot of time, at least in robotics, on Mars, and it is a very familiar place in an interesting way. Even though I have personally never been there, it's just like, I feel like it's a place I know.
If we dropped you on Mars tomorrow, would you be able to kind of know where you were on the planet based on being there as a robot?
I think that's a really interesting question. There are places on Mars that are just so familiar, rocks that I just like, I imprinted in my mind. And yet at the same time, I wonder, because I'm used to seeing them through Rover eyes. And yes, it would be familiar if it was one of the places that I have explored with a robot. But at the same time, I think it would take some orienting because it would be a different perspective. But yeah, I mean, right now, Perseverance is in a Jezero crater, and the places around it are really familiar. It's very different from where, Curiosity was, or Spirit and Opportunity were. And so if you, teleported from one to the other, you would know whether you're in Meridiani or in Jezero or in Gale. So that is something that I feel like I would, and yet I'm not sure.
So India has a hyper-competitive scholastic culture.
Yeah, I think it's, I think from a very young age, I was like drawn to math and science. It was something where I read this book and it was fascinating to me. At the same time, it was like, why does she want to do this? I definitely remember my mom being like, just sort of like, puzzled. and so, but it was a world I was fascinated with. So I definitely felt I was working against some of the expectations. And yet the curiosity took the better of me because I was like, I just want to know.
Yeah.
I just want to know. The more I explored, the more actually fascinating it got. And so, one thing continues to lead to the other. And I just wanted to explore more and more. And so I went to school for engineering. And after I graduated, I really wanted to do more with that. And I applied for a scholarship and came to the US. And I did some of the really early work in like AI. And I was fascinated with that, and really working with computers and the internet was really exciting at the time. And I spent a lot of time working with that. And then moved to Carnegie Mellon because that is where a lot of research was happening in AI. And then I took this robotics class for programming robots. There were these trash can robots, with sonars. And that really was like something where I was like, wow, this is what I want to do.
So what did you build with the sonar robots?
So there was a maze, and we had to collect, they were competing robots, and there was theoretical gold. They were balloons, and the robots that collected the most won the competition. And my team ended up winning it because, but you have your time in class, and we would be in the hallways at Carnegie Mellon just driving these things all night. It wasn't like work. You just was, it was so much fun that we spent all our extra time just working on that. So I loved it right from the moment I started doing robotics.
So why don't we start really at the simplest level? What is a robot?
It's interesting. One of my professors, there used to be this question where I won't go there, but he used to come, he would have this philosophical debate where he would conclude with like a rock as a robot. So it is very much a question in robotics where you can take it to the, philosophical extent of it. But in terms of, for me, it is sort of an embodied system that allows us to sort of affect the world in a, and you could add the intelligence on it, but I think that's sort of a more maybe mundane definition.
So when you're thinking about, you're trying to make a robot do what you want, and they are these embodied machines, how do you work with hardware, different kinds of materials, different electrical systems to kind of match the goal, for it to match the goal in your head to complete a task? How do you do that?
Giving an example of one of the Mars robots that I was recently involved with, and what many of us find fascinating in space robotics versus terrestrial robotics is the constraints. So you do have a task you're trying to do. Like for us with Perseverance, it was to collect these tubes of samples from Mars so that we could eventually bring them back to Earth. So it's a somewhat defined, and yet at the same time, it is another planet. We're bringing these back to look for signs of life. So there are certain constraints. You have to preserve those signs of life. And then there are limits to what's the size of a rocket. Like now, you're designing a robot, but it is like we've got to fit it on a rocket. It's got to survive in the Martian environment, which is much harsher than Earth. And what are the computers that we can use that can survive in that environment? So there are some of these constraints that you then start to think about. And then what we're going to accomplish. And then there's a lot of saying, what have we done before? Even though we do want to keep doing new things, it is helpful to be like, what's the risk in terms of doing this new thing versus the advantage of doing something that we've done before? And so that's weighs into the design. And that's why you see, you're like, why have we been doing Rockabogie Rovers for like, these are those robots that have 6 wheels, and they have like a suspension system that keeps the body flat while the wheels move. Different from most cars on the Earth, but that's what a lot of robots you might have seen pictures of on Mars are like. That's because we've realized some of the benefit of that, and there's an advantage, and there are disadvantages. Most of these don't go sideways, for example, which is called crabbing. But at the same time,
Crabbing, like a hermit
like
crab.
a crab,
Yeah,
essentially.
Okay. Yeah.
But so we weigh these trade-offs of saying, I'm trying to accomplish this. What do I borrow from things I know to do? What do I completely innovate? There's always that element. And that's what sort of drives many of us is none of these are exactly the same as before. It's not like a repeat. There is always a new element. But how do I do it in a way that what I'm doing that is new, I believe will actually work with high probability, so that, I'm not sort of just hoping.
Yeah.
I've designed it to succeed, and then we try to sort of reduce that risk. And yet, on landing day, all of us are eating our peanuts, which is our lucky thing to do at JPL, because there is, we've never done that specific thing before. And so you're still like, gosh, if this thing works, that's why when you see the folks at NASA jumping up and down, it's like, I had done all my, calculations, but I still can't believe it worked.
I love, so I'm so glad to know that these hardcore scientists do harbor some superstitious affect. So that's great. And why peanuts?
It's actually, the story goes that we've had a lot of failures. So, actually getting to Mars, what we realize is it's actually still really difficult. They call Mars a graveyard for spacecraft, still is. If you plot the statistics of how many missions have launched and how many have actually successfully accomplished the mission, it doesn't look so good. And so we'd had a string of failures, and there was the mission that was being launched, and people were eating peanuts and just sort of, and it succeeded. So since then, it's like, let's not change this aspect of it. We control this.
Okay, so can you, Vandi, like paint the picture of Mars? What is the landscape like? So maybe pick one of your rovers, and tell us about the color, the atmosphere. If we were standing on Mars next to this rover, what would it be like?
Yeah, so it is a beautiful place. It's stunning, and every location is quite different. So I most like Meridiani, where Opportunity was just sand
Sorry, where
ripples.
was it?
Meridiani,
Uh-huh.
and it was mostly sand. Very, very. So if you were standing there, it would sort of look like parts of Death Valley, where you see just lots and lots of sand. And yet at the same time, Perseverance has landed in Jezreel. And when you look at it from orbit, the reason we were going there is because it's an ancient river delta. So we believe there was water that flew in, and there's a delta. I mean, you can clearly see this delta. And so if you're going to look for signs of ancient life, scientists were like, that's a pretty good place to go. The river sort of enters, and has like a alluvial fan that it creates. And so it was entering this crater. And you can see that. And then when you're on the surface, these walls are really high. So even though it's a delta, right, like it's a very different perspective from the surface than it is like from orbit. So if you're standing on Mars, there is definitely a lot of dust.
Where on Earth would be a similar place?
Yeah. It's interesting that the scientists name all the quadrants after places on Earth. So there are a lot of places that we go to, for example, where Curiosity went to, the Curiosity rover, which was the one before Perseverance in Gale, or, Perseverance. There are these craters, and if you look at the cross-section, it's sort of like the Grand Canyon a little bit. And the reason we're going there is there are contacts between changes. You can see past history preserved, right? Why the Grand Canyon is interesting. From a robotics perspective, we look at the terrain. So it looks very red, like because the dust has a lot of content, the mineral content is such that's what's very different. But
is it iron, or what makes it red?
Yeah, it is a lot of that. And then, it is a lot like places you might see in Utah in the United States. So it really does like look a lot like some of these places. So Mars is neat in some ways. There are places in the solar system that would be very alien worlds. Like if you took Venus or Enceladus, icy worlds, or, Jupiter or others. But Mars is close enough to Earth that it's you literally can connect it to places and we do. So that's very helpful in terms of driving. And yet at the same time, it's not Earth. The pressure is different, and the sort of atmosphere is different.
And how so?
So the gravity is a third of the gravity of Earth. So when we are testing our robots, we design them for Earth. We actually, in order to make it easier to test, we make it so we can move the arm in Earth gravity, which means we've essentially over-designed it for Mars.
So what do you mean by simulations? Are these physical simulations, or you do the physical simulations on Earth and then you do the computation for how you should actually build it when it's on Mars?
Some of both. So some of it we do purely on software, and some of it is like we actually build a full-scale replica of the rover on Earth and operated in our Mars yard. So
your Mars yard?
Yeah.
What's that? Tell us what that is.
Oh, so at JPL we have a place called the Mars yard, and it is a yard where we've got like different slopes that replicate different parts of Mars, and we can sculpt it and change it depending on where we're going. And we have a shed in which we have the different robots. And if you want to test something, you drive it out into the simulated Mars world and test it. Now, of course, you've got Earth's gravity and Earth's atmosphere. So here's a case where the robot itself is physically an Earth robot, but you're changing some of its mind. So part of it,
you're changing its mind.
Yes, because you're telling it it's on Mars gravity, right? It's actually on Earth gravity, but it's operating. It knows how to account for the difference. So those are the sorts of ways where you're saying, how do you adjust the simulation? Sometimes it's purely like a video game. You are basically simulating Mars, taking images from a past mission and telling it's there. Other times, you're kind of playing with parts of the mind of the robot, but the physical robot is actually on a test bed on Earth. So there's all kinds of different levels, and you have to understand what is it that you're trying to do and what parts of it are simulated and what parts of it are real.
So when you're doing these tests, you have to think kind of about two things at once in parallel. So knowing that it's Earth's gravity, but the landscape or the slope, let's say, is designed like it is Mars, and your programming is like as if it's on Mars, but the robot is not behaving as if it's on Mars because it's on Earth. You're kind of making up that gap, that difference, right? And
That's right.
yeah.
And that's what we have to do. And, it gets more and more imaginative if you're going to places that are further and further from Earth, right? Because we do build them here, and you do, spend years testing it. And we cannot create a whole chamber replicating in another environment, especially if you're driving, tens of kilometers. That would be very challenging to have that kind of a space. So that's what's, I think, fascinating about it. But when you're on Mars, it's going back to the question you were asking, it is that kind of a landscape, but it's also a lot of craters because atmosphere is 1% the atmosphere of Earth. So most recently, we had a helicopter on Mars. And that is like, we can fly on Mars, but we had to spin the rotors really fast because it's so thin, you need to generate the same amount of lift. You have to spin them at 24 to 2,800 RPM, which is like flying at 100,000 feet on Earth because,
wow.
Essentially, so that's the kind of different environment. You're like, oh, it looks like it's a flying at 10 meters above. But what you have to do to understand that, to make it possible to do that, you have to understand what the atmosphere is like, what testing you can do here, and what parts of it, map over and what don't.
And that helicopter was a pretty big risk for NASA, right?
Right. And I think that's the sort of thing we do all the time. It was what we call a technology demonstration. So we have missions where we're trying to do science, where there's a purpose, and the robot is essentially a means to an end. What we're really trying to do is the science. And you're like, design me the robot that'll let me do the science. And there are other times where we're like, there's science we really want to do that we cannot get to unless we make this leap in robotics. And so we're just going to do a test, highly risky. I'm not going to have $1 billion mission and riding on it, but I'm going to take this risk. And often they're along other missions where that part of it is highly risky. But if it succeeds, we open up this whole world of science. And so that's what Ingenuity, the helicopter, was like an experiment. Nothing had ever flown on Mars and control powered flight. And we wanted to know if we could do that.
And what was the feeling like when you realized that it could?
It's interesting. I was actually there on the day we did the first flight. And this is true of everything that happens in robotics and planetary science, right? Even though it seems like things are going according to plan when you hear the story of the mission, I don't think there's ever a time it ever does. And I'm not saying it's like things are always going wrong. I just know what so many people behind the scenes did to fix all the little things, each one of which could have meant that this wasn't going to work. So we actually had what you call a race condition in computer science, where there's a possibility, there's a probability, it might not guarantee to happen, but there's a path through the software and the avionics where the rotors, we would not have been able to spin them. We would just basically wouldn't have flown. It would have been like it didn't fly. And there was a chance that would have happened. And we knew that was going to happen. And so they'd taken the risk. So we had all this media, all this stuff. And we're sitting there and being like, well, it may or may not fly today. Because this was a distinct possibility with this race condition. So it was all the more exciting when it did, because, it may not have happened that day. I mean, it didn't mean that it was going to be destroyed. It just meant we'd have to come back another day.
Mm-hmm. That's so cool. That feeling must be amazing. When I saw you last time, you had to rush home, and I was like, "Why?" You said, "Well, I have to go drive," and I assumed you meant because we're in Los Angeles, like traffic is terrible. You have to go home, but what you really meant is that you had to go drive the robot, and it really just blew my mind. So what does it mean to drive a robot? Can you walk us through what it's like to command a rover to do something on an alien planet?
Right. It's funny. I'd forgotten that part, but it's so I think it's when we're trying to command the robot. So if we are say driving, and we might be driving or we may be using the robotic arm, we kind of know what we're trying to do. And we've started to, over time, it used to look very different, a few rovers ago that I worked on, but now it's very visual. So we actually, humans we are getting closer and closer to that. And I think this makes a lot of sense is, what is the part that humans are good at? And we focus on that. And so for a drive, we know where we're trying to get to. We suck in the images from the rover. So you have essentially various tools. There's a whole set of tools, and they are specialized, but they allow the rover driver to be in the context of what the rover is seeing around it, but also the orbital overhead map and also where we're trying to get to.
Oh, so you have to keep all these in your head at once to feel like you're a rover, all these different views.
Yeah, and it is you get used to that. So you're both looking as if you were flying over Mars, looking down at it, and also as if you are standing where the rover is looking out with its eyes. You want both of those perspectives because you are trying to get to a goal that the rover can't see from where it is, usually when we're driving really far distances. And so that's why you need what we call the orbital overhead map, because it'll tell you, of course, like where there are craters or things. There's no point having it figure it out on the ground. And then you also look at the rover perspective. So we have all this imagery. And then we've sort of abstracted it so humans don't have to think about things they don't have to think about. Because there are things that we're very good at creating patterns for. And so there's no point the rover hunting and pecking around self-driving, figuring out it's autonomous driving, but I'm going to give it certain waypoints, as we call it. So sort of like breadcrumbs. And they're not literally breadcrumbs spaced so close apart. They may be 100 meters away.
It'd be funny to find bread on Mars, but yes, so not literally.
Oh gosh, that would be, we would have done our job if we found breadcrumbs. But essentially, there's sort of these things that human intuition allows us to be like, I know this is a sandy area and I'm keeping you away from it. So we have come to a way in which we use humans and the robot for what they're good at. In the near term, humans give it instruction to say very precisely where it can drive because you're seeing from the rover's view. But as soon as it has moved its wheels, it has cameras, and it's, those of you who have been in self-driving cars on Earth too, once it's driving, it's using that kind of information. And the information we had at the time we created the drive is stale. It knows more than we did. So now we are laying out this information and the abstraction to say, use your brain, use your self-driving capability to get to this position. And yet, I don't want you to deviate from it in this way and this way. So we're kind of putting bounds on it. And this is where it comes into, mostly we've all, like you were talking about earlier, we've seen robots do crazy things. And that's lots of fun because, most roboticists or AI researchers love to find the loophole as how can I get this robot to do a thing a human would never do, like the really dumb thing, right? And so we are trying to provide guardrails on that. So we built a system to do that. So you're very visually laying out these waypoints, and we have these boxes we call keep-in boxes.
Keep in
this area. And then we might see a crater and say, keep out of that area, literally like that. So it's common sense. Say, don't go there. I already know that's not something you can navigate. And I don't want you to deviate beyond this, because if you do, you're going away from the intended goal.
And this is, you're programming this and coding this at your computer screen in JPL.
That's right. So it's very much driving the robot is essentially a computer. It's sort of like you're working in the computer simulation. It's a little closer to like a video game than pure coding. Yes, many of us who operate the rovers wrote some of the code on the rover, but human beings aren't very good at writing a program. So we essentially create like a video game. We take plan we created for the whole
simulation.
A visual simulation.
Got it.
So the rover, we have a 3D world we create with the images we have. Now you can imagine we have partial information. So it's a it's a very interesting, when you look at video games, they're so high fidelity right now. But we don't have that kind of information about where we're going on Mars. We are literally going where no human or robot has ever gone. So there are so many ways that we write software where they can be what we call in machine learning and in robotics false positives, where it encounters an error and say, oh gosh, all bets are off. I'm about to destroy myself. And it's just actually, no, you're just looking at your shadow or something akin to that, right? Like,
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing where we would catch it in simulation and be like, oh, this is not really, how do we get around making sure it understands this is not a real problem? Or if it is, adjust it. So we run these simulations and then these commands, then we radiate them to Mars.
And wow. So it's kind of like sending a message in a bottle.
It is.
Yeah. Vandi, you've talked several times about driving the robot. What do you mean by that?
Right. It is interesting. We call it driving, but it's not like any driving we do on Earth because there's such a time delay between Earth and Mars, and it depends on where Earth and Mars are relative to each other. So, as they're both rotating around the sun and they have different orbits, so the distance between Earth and Mars changes. And that essentially means that the light time distance that it takes for a signal to go from Earth to Mars is changing.
And what's the range of minutes?
So, it can vary anywhere from like 4 minutes to 20 plus minutes. So
Wow.
It's quite a lot. And that is if you had the Deep Space Network, which is, these 3 large antennas. We have them at Goldstone and Canberra in Australia and Madrid in Spain. So we radiate commands through those antennas to the rovers. So you also need to have time on these antennas because there's lots of spacecraft we are operating. So because we can't control them in real time, you can't just essentially have brakes and a pedal and you're controlling it, because the time delay would essentially mean that you hit the brakes and half an hour later it stops.
Yeah.
That just doesn't work. And so essentially the way we do it is we program what we're going to do for the entire sol. So a Martian day we call a sol.
SOL.
SOL, because it's approximately 40 minutes longer than an Earth day, because that's, how long it takes for Mars to spin. So when we first land a spacecraft, humans on Earth go on Mars time. Essentially, we are operating by the Martian clock. So we wake up and go to sleep by Mars, not by Earth. And at that time, essentially, we are sending commands to the spacecraft for a sol. But this changes once people go back to their normal lives. Then sometimes we actually might send instructions for a whole weekend. So once we start taking the weekends off, we might send it on a Friday, like we did last Friday, for the whole weekend.
I didn't realize this. So how long are you living on Martian time? Like your team, is it weeks or months before you felt like you could maybe take a weekend and enjoy Earth time?
Yeah. So, we do it for most of the Mars missions. The tradition has been to do it for 90 sols, 90 days. And so the first 3 months are very critical because there's lots of things that can go wrong. It's just sort of like any new thing you get, the warranties are for that first period because things go wrong usually in the beginning. And so we stay on Mars time because we can very quickly react to what happens. As soon as the robot has finished doing what it's done, we work the Martian night shift. So we work at night to figure out what it would do for the whole day. As soon as the sun is rising on Mars, we've sent the commands up, and then we sleep the Martian daytime because it's executing the plan. And then it sends us the results and said what it did at the end of the daylight, because we use cameras and daylight is helpful for the rovers on Mars. And then we come back and work the night shift, and then we start reducing the timeline so that if the the results come back from Mars really late in the day, then we come back the next day. So we won't work the whole night because people, they have lives. They need to get in sync with the humans in their lives. So,
Mm-hmm.
so we do that for the first 3 months.
That's really cool. I didn't know that your whole sleep schedule was adjusted like that.
I actually really like Mars time, even though it does mess with your schedule, because you don't have to wait to find out what happened. And then, there are other parts where we know we're going to encounter certain things and we design it. So one of them is, we did drive on roads on Mars, and as you're on Earth, and if you're driving, you have an odometer that tells you how far you've gone. But if you've done any off-road driving, sometimes if you're driving off-road and you're in like slick mud, your wheels will spin. Your odometer is showing that it's moving, but you're not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So when we are driving, we know the destination where we want to go is, say, 700 meters away. But actually, as the rover is driving, it's going to slip some. So it might actually travel, if it slips a certain amount, it might actually be going 900 meters. It might need to spin its wheels 900 meters to just get to that 700 meters. And so the question is, how do you account for that? You don't want to overshoot. You don't want to undershoot. And so that's something we build in, the ability for it to do what we call visual odometry, because the odometer is essentially fooling the robot. We take a picture and then we take another picture. And then with the visual differencing, we says, if there was a rock in one image and there's a rock that, has it moved the 1 meter between your driving? And if it hasn't moved, you actually haven't moved that far. So that's different ways we might build in the capability. And so that's something we deploy on the rovers, because we know there is this uncertainty and it might encounter some sand.
Mm-hmm.
And so we allow it to, on its own, adjust for it.
What's so in addition to allowing space for the robot to adapt either to a different science goal or to be more accurate about where it's going, there's also, in any science experiment, this element of surprise. Can you tell us about like a moment of surprise, like something that you didn't anticipate?
Oh gosh, there's so many, and they're lots of fun, because we like to second guess and guess, and that's something you get good at after a while, because you sort of start to get more familiar with what Mars is going to throw at you, and very often we are able to anticipate that, and it would seem as if the rover just did what we told it, but actually it adjusted for a lot of those things. But then there are times when there's a complete curveball, and that happens more often than not. So, for example, with Perseverance, we were wanting to collect intact cores because we want to bring them back eventually to Earth.
And intact cores is you drill down and then you get that cylinder.
Yes. So you drill. In this case, we were literally collecting like a solid piece of chalk, essentially. So the first one, we drilled, and you look at the telemetry, which is essentially what the rover sends as the data of what it did, sort of like a script of here's what I did, here's the result and all. And it's like, da-da-da, everything went according to plan. And we were like, this is great. And we essentially held the sample up to its cameras and took a picture. And said, there was nothing in it. So we were like, everything went according to plan, and there's nothing at all.
Yeah.
So essentially, as we were collecting the sample, it had just disintegrated around it. So we had not collected any of it. Just the very first one. And often it is this sort of thing. We adjusted our parameters and were able to, make the next one a success. But this was a case of, we were all like, this is going to be great.
Yeah. Did you feel, Vandi, like frustrated or disappointed, or it's funny to, like, if a child, for instance, were to lie to you about something that, yes, I brushed my teeth, but they didn't, you might be mad at them if you're their parent. Do you have that? Do you have sense of like a sense of joy when the rover is doing what you want it to do, what it's been programmed to do, or frustration or even anger when it misbehaves, let's say?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking of my kids because, yes, they will do the brush where you're just like, okay, did you just kind of like actually brush your teeth? Well, I think very many people who program at any level. Because I remember feeling this even when I was in grad school. You're just by your computer, and when a program works, like it's an extension of that feeling where you're just like, oh my gosh. I still remember sitting in my desk in the middle of the night, and I'd be like, like you let out some
Yelp.
whatever expression
Yeah.
of joy because you're just so excited. You're like, it worked, because you have done everything, and yet it is a complicated thing. So when it does work, it is this joy. Like, it's absolutely true. Like every thing you do in a planetary world is exciting in that way because it isn't routine, right? Like, there's always this possibility that we call it the dinosaur bone. Like, it's literally like any place could be entirely different from what we expect.
The dinosaur bone?
Yeah, it's essentially like, we are looking for signs of life. And so there is this expression, right? Like, there could be the dinosaur bone. And are we going to miss it, or are we going to find it? So you can find it at any time, essentially. And that joy you feel when things go right is absolutely true. But what's interesting when they don't go, the scientists, I'm not going to say, for them, but they might be sad because we didn't get the result. But from a roboticist's point of view, it is so exciting because it means this is not going to be a boring day, right? Like, and it is actually because you know that you want to understand what happened, because robots are not arbitrary, and the reason there is an explanation for why a certain result occurred, and there is a mystery to be solved there that I think it's sort of like even a bug in your in code for people who might program. Figuring out why something went wrong is a puzzle, and it means that it's going to be interesting. It's definitely, you didn't already anticipate it. That by definition means that it is non-trivial and it's going to be interesting.
I really love working with engineers because everything is a problem that can be solved. That's like how you go through life. It's if it is a problem, then it's fixable. And I think that must be almost magical.
It is actually, it's funny. One of my professors in graduate school, machine learning professors, he says, the thing about researchers was great is we have a sort of an amnesia where every time there is this thing and we have a new algorithm, we're like, we can fool ourselves into believing this is just going to do it.
Can you give us an example of what you learned driving one robot and how it impacted how you designed the next one?
So, one of the examples would be like on the Curiosity mission, we had this ability for the rover to look at a wide angle image and figure out what was interesting. So using its onboard intelligence to say, what's an interesting rock to zap with my laser? We have a laser with which we can zap the rock. It creates a plasma and we can study it with the telescopic imager. The challenge was that's great and it worked beautifully. There were times at which the rover might have been doing something beforehand, like sampling or drilling, and that might not have succeeded. So the arm could be in the way. And now you're shooting the laser at the surface and you're going to shoot your own arm. So, that and we did have the capability, so it knew that it wouldn't collide with the rover's body. But the way we were doing it was coarse, so it was being very conservative. So we realized in the next mission that the most interesting thing often is right in like what we can actually reach with the robotic arm. And how do we design the system so that it allows us to adjust how conservative we want to be? Because, we in the rover's whole body, there's a thing in robotics we call a collision model. So a rover has a notion of its body, so it's not going to collide with itself, and then it doesn't collide with certain surfaces. So we treated the laser as something like you don't collide with this body, and so solved it in sort of 3D geometric space. But this is an example of saying, we learned from a previous mission what can happen, and let's allow the rover itself to have that intelligence to avoid it.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you can program intelligence and flexibility into a rover. So more and more, Vandi, I imagine that in designing missions of the future, that intelligence is going to be even more robust. Perhaps the ability for the rover to make intelligent decisions in real time without a human checking every step will only become more frequent.
It is self-sufficient in certain ways, right? Like if it communication with Earth allows us to know what it's doing and also manage its power and go on. Like it is true, for example, Ingenuity, once, I won't use an example, but like it is true that the rovers could go on based on the way we programmed them, even if we lost contact with Earth for some period of time, coming up and managing their power, but it wouldn't be very useful. So as a robot on Mars, it's getting a set of instructions for what to do for the day. And humans are telling it where it is on the map of Mars. Because as it's driving, it does some of its adjustments, but it's slowly kind of drifting and getting lost. Now, we do have the ability to do visual odometry, and we use inertial measurements units, and we use accelerometers, but things are approximate. We don't currently have GPS on Mars. So as it's going, it's essentially looking at the area around it. Self-driving can keep it very safe from the hazard right in front of it, but it's sort of slowly getting lost. It doesn't know where exactly it is on Mars. We actually just this week are working on putting capability using a computer to, we keep adding new capability on the rover that is going to give it the ability to pinpoint its own position, where it's going to look around it and take that image, take the orbital image, which we will have sent to the rover, which we currently don't do, and it would project it and try to search for where it is. And then will teleport itself to that location and be like, no, I'm not here where I thought it was, but I'm here. So we're working on that ability. But in some ways, it has a notion of where it is and the instructions for what it's following, but it is approximate right now.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the laser, I didn't know that the software that you had built could be so flexible to incorporate new capabilities over time. That's so cool. With the laser, pointing at a rock and psh, pew pew. You were saying that the rover you've programmed it to have its own decision-making process of when to do that or which rocks to laser. Same thing with deciding or programming it for it to decide what rocks are interesting. So I'm so curious how you're programming autonomy or elements of autonomy into these robots over time, and making them like kind of your co-engineer almost, or your co-scientist. Can you imagine a future that has really robust computing power? It uses AI models and visual recognition techniques. It knows precisely where it is. It decides what's interesting to allow it even greater autonomy from the scientists back at JPL.
Absolutely. Like, that is actually some of the things that I'm very actively working on because, we've explored Mars and, we've talked about like a lot of the challenges, but a lot of what we want to do in planetary exploration, we have the scientists lay out what they want to do for the whole decade. The NASA sort of commissions the National Science Foundation to do that. And a lot of what we want to do is go even further out, right? Like actually go explore the icy moons, Europa and Enceladus. We've got a spacecraft, Europa Clipper, is going to Europa. We're going to learn stuff. And once we see these worlds in even more detail, you want to get to the surface, you know what you want to do with that. We've got spacecraft going to Venus and, it's got sulfuric acid clouds. And so there's all these very interesting worlds that we're sending spacecraft to, and we know so little about them. So we are absolutely going to have to rely on autonomous capabilities and AI for it, not just to adapt, but also to use its resources efficiently. So some of the ways we're already using it that you can expand on, and then there'll be all kinds of new ways. So one is, like you were mentioning, we have this capability that we've had for a few rovers, and we've kept enhancing it, where it takes a wide angle image because, we're driving really far distances. And as we're driving far.
Like how far? in
Well,
a day?
relatively speaking, the furthest we've gone is 700 meters in a day, but now that is the limit. Usually it can vary anywhere depending on the science where they want to go.
Is
It
that
can
is that because of the power to move the rover? It's limited to that distance?
Actually multiple reasons. So that distance that we drove was over 3 sols on a weekend plan. So yes, it's power limited on how much it can drive in 1 sol. That's been a few hundred meters. But over multiple sols, the limitation has been the uncertainty. It's starting to get more and more lost. And so you don't want to deviate. So this is where this new capability we are putting in where we can localize it on board will allow it to break that barrier. So that barrier has been there for some of the power reasons. And also at that point, you want Earth to sync up because we tell the rover currently from the ground where it is on the map of Mars. So that's one of the limitations. But as we have these capabilities, we've been using it to do this way, as we're driving, we might miss things along the way. So it's telling us, hey, I saw this interesting rock. I collected science by zapping it and taking science measurements. Other ways we're using it is in resource management. So we have something called an onboard planner, which on board the rover will be like, well, I should put the rover to nap at this time. So, space rovers they nap a lot.
They nap.
They nap because they have, radioisotopes, but it's actually got a battery it's charging. And so a lot of it is about managing the power. When do you heat the motors? Most of these places are very cold, the planetary bodies. And so you have to heat the motors. And so when should scheduling all of this stuff? So there is AI capability to do that. There's so much potential for what we can use it for. The self-driving capability is sort of more autonomous navigation, but more and more determining, right, what is navigable, where am I going to get stuck? And as we start to get into some of these other planetary bodies, the other thing is the lifetime of the mission is going to be much shorter.
Mm-hmm.
They're not actually going to survive these decade plus that we've been doing. So now you really don't want to be waiting for Earth to tell you even what to do.
Is that just because their lifetimes to be shorter because you expect that if it's going into the unknown, that's the point, that it will likely encounter some kind of fatality earlier?
That is one of the reasons, but the bigger reason in some cases, right, like say we're going to Europa or Enceladus, many of these places you're going further and further away from the sun. So there is lesser light, they're much colder. So just the power you need to survive is challenging. And the radiation in some of these places is so much that we don't currently have avionics and hardware that can survive the radiation for more than a certain period of time.
So let's take Europa. Europa is a moon of Jupiter. And as you mentioned, NASA just sent this past October a spacecraft that will reach it, I think, in 2030. And it's such an exciting mission because scientists think that under this very cold, icy shell, there's a vast subsurface ocean, and that's caused by what's called tidal flexing from its home planet Jupiter that warms up the core. So it's a really fascinating place to explore because, as we think, water is essential to life on Earth, or at least life as we know it. So if you let's say the Europa Clipper goes, it sends data back. It's very exciting because it's found thinner places on this icy surface. How would you design a future mission that would leverage AI? What kinds of AI? And how would those AIs help it be autonomous to execute something really, really difficult, which is to drill down into that icy surface?
It takes so many forms, right? Because it's just sort of like AI outside of space. AI has existed for such a long time. But what we call AI today is very different from what was AI in the 80s, for example, right? So you'll come across people who've worked on AI, and we've had models which were using, like, say, expert systems or various scheduling systems and others were a form of AI. But generally what people think of as AI now is very much more machine learning based, right? So it's data-driven science. And what's actually interesting is in some places, like for Mars, we actually do have a ton of data. Now, it might not be what current models have been trained on, but we do have a ton of data. And so I'm very excited about the possibility for planetary bodies that we've already explored. So how we can just literally, I expect that we're just going to accelerate the missions that come, say, to Mars, because what we can do to leverage the data is enormous potential there. And there are experiments we're doing with this and working on to say, like, and well, one advantage about a planetary body and doing AI in that is every single thing we've done to instruct robots on Mars or to control them is based on data. Like, there is no human that has currently been to Mars. So we have this beautiful data set and it's all digital. It is perfectly suited for AI. So I think that's what is very exciting to me is we know what, but it's very messy. It's been very hard to use that data without the AI because human beings use the data using the background knowledge they have. Now, when we go further out, we will have very little information. So that becomes very interesting. And I think it's a potential to push the envelope of the field is how do you extrapolate from the patterns that we do have to novel situations?
And can you go a little bit into how machine learning techniques that you would embed on a spacecraft to do these autonomous things, and what data would you train it on?
In some ways, if you think about it, right, like the humans that we're designing these missions, we do have a sense of what we're trying to accomplish, and we have certain models and assumptions about it, and we're basing it on that. What we get when we put AI on it is this very fast iteration. So now, a lot of robotics, what is neat and which is a part that is very fascinating is what you could do with simulation, right? You can, before you actually and for robotics, what's interesting is before you take an action in the real world, you can run thousands of simulations and determine what the right thing to do it. Now, we are actually doing, and we were talking about this earlier, that is kind of how we operate the rovers, with the human in the loop. We're essentially talking about a small step from that, which is to say it would do it on board, right? You have certain assumptions, the actions you would take, and you can project what the outcome would be. And we have something we do very frequently in planetary exploration with humans, operators, which we call a TOTEP. So when we encounter a completely new sandy terrain, like on Mars, we might actually do a controlled drive into it. We call it a TOTEP to see, am I actually going to see what I predicted in terms of this traction? And then I'm actually going to do the drive. And I'll adjust it if it was more or less than I expected. And we do the same thing with drilling. We used to do this all the time with the Curiosity rover. Because we actually thought we would have gooey pulver, we would do something called a mini drill. So it collected sample once it drilled more than 20 millimeters. So we would drill less than that just to kind of see was the rate of penetration and the way we were getting matching the model. Now you can imagine extrapolating that to some place like Enceladus, where everything you do, you can in a very controlled way take the initial step, have the robot do it, and then match it to its simulation, adjust the simulation till the actuation of how it's affecting the environment matches. And so you're much more effective. And it's absolutely something we're going to have to do. Also, when are you communicating to Earth? Humans, I don't think will be out of the loop. So when you say the broader perspective of the science questions, we are sending these because we have like a whole slew of scientists on Earth. I don't think we want to wait till we have robots that are intelligent enough. And that's something I do think we want to do things and vary the human-robot coordination in the planetary, if you say, is that, and still use the AI to effectiveness. So I think we're going to start out and the scientists on Earth will still be controlling what is interesting and what is scientific. But we're not going to wait in this iterative way we do to say, get the results back. So it's managing its own survival resources, knows when the next window is to talk to Earth. What is the thing I can do to get the most interesting pieces of information that'll help them make a decision. And we call that actually decisional data. We still call that even now. And it's called decisional because it's for decisions for Earth-based science and engineers. And I need to send that at a particular time. So it's managing its resources, knowing when it's communicating. So that's very much a AI problem of uncertainty because it's a very uncertain system how much resources it's actually going to take. You're predicting it and managing that. And then there's another element of, should I actually, out of the various possibilities, which target should I get to? And I think that's something that we're going to expand on, where it's going to run a simulation and say, am I going to hit a joint limit? Like when I do this, am I going to hit a hard stop or a soft stop? That's actually not that hard to do. And we're definitely going to be doing that. But what's interesting is actually a harder problem. So I think the scientists pre-specify what they're looking for. It's going to look at that and the engineering constraint and probably collect some scouting data to send back. It may continue progressing and collecting sample, but maybe the scientists on Earth have got this piece of information to say, wait a minute, I wanted to adjust what it's doing. So I think we're going to have this kind of semi-supervised operation, but it's going to be on a very, very time scale. Like I think that it's essentially going to be a learning system, but doing that. So I think that's how I envision that is more practical to see. It is still going to involve humans, but with a huge delay.
But Vandi, in the far, far future, and future spacecrafts will be equipped with AIs that will make them very autonomous. Do you think that an AI-powered spacecraft will be the first to detect life beyond Earth?
Yes, it's to me, it almost seems inevitable that is the case because it is actually, I think the first contact seems most likely by a intelligent robotic entity. Now, humans are always going to want to explore space as well, and we are absolutely going to have that. But the probability that it'll be in the frontiers of exploration is high, and that I think is going to be robotics. I hope we continue to explore with humans and then continue to explore with robots further beyond that.
It's just so weird that two kinds of alien intelligences might interact without us. A machine that learns on its own and makes decisions and is artificially intelligent, has this computer alien mind, might detect biological alien life in our solar system. That's just incredible to me. So let's talk about life. It's really the category of life has changed a lot over time, and it's still really difficult to define what life is. It does die. Maybe it has metabolism. But then there are extreme examples of life on Earth that we're really just learning about. Like tardigrades can survive in outer space. Extremophiles near hydrothermal vents at super, super hot temperatures can also survive. And so the variety of possible life forms on Earth, the squishiness of the definition of what life is, it seems to me that searching for life in an alien context is really difficult. So if Mars did have life and the rovers that you're driving are navigating these artifacts, this really ancient history where water flowed and perhaps there were organic materials, perhaps even maybe microorganisms or little creatures, how do you think about the difficulty of this search for life beyond Earth as an engineering problem that you use robots to help you try to solve?
So it's very interesting with robotics because when you're looking for life, you don't want to take it with you. And so that adds a whole dimension. So you're building this robot for a very harsh environment, and you have to bake it and cook it and do things in ways that remove anything you might carry with you. And then we have to come up with ways in which we can make sure we are checking. So, for example, on a lot of our missions, we carry, we have something like a baseline. So we had on Curiosity, we could drill into these blanks so that you can take out what we take from Earth. And so when you collect a sample, you can remove those signatures. So it's a very interesting problem, right? Because we don't know what we're looking for.
Right.
And yet we have a definition of what we call life, and the instruments we design. And then how do you make sure that the measurements you are taking, and you're trying to also look at the context, because there's a lot of information about how it sort of is the puzzle that you piece together. So I think it's really interesting because you're sort of sending planetary scientists in one sort of machine and thinking about how you do that and how do you preserve that pristineness of that sample makes it much more challenging than just designing the robot to look for it.
Right. And so, what would be a definite biosignature, a definite sign of life using the instruments aboard a rover currently on Mars? Would it see something that might be lifelike, and then would it do a chemical analysis? How would it confirm something?
In fact, we did have that kind of an experience very recently in Jezero, where we have instruments. So we have an instrument called Sherlock, and has a context camera called Watson, and we have another instrument called Pixel. And we took these measurements, and the signatures really correlated. So you're looking for signatures that correlate. So when you look at it, there's already from the visual, scientists have a trained eye. So it's sort of like sort of like you were asking me the question about, how do I feel Mars through a robot? And it is definitely a familiar place. It's much easier to drive a subsequent robot. And it's sort of like you understand what it looks like to see through the rover's eyes. Similarly, the scientists on Earth, they know what they're looking for, right? Like when they go into the field. So they know already that, oh, this is an interesting target. And sometimes from orbit, we know this shiny spot, this is where I'm trying to get to. And then when we get there, the instruments sort of corroborate a hypothesis they may have. And so when they look at the results, and we had that, and we actually collected a sample at that location, which we might subsequently, have on Perseverance. So we may actually have collected signs of organic life. Now we're only going to know once we have that sample back on Earth. But the excitement in seeing the signatures, now there's always the uncertainty, and the probability is low. So it doesn't look like something where you just look at it, and I don't think we're going to find intelligent or currently alive life very soon from what we have seen. Now it is possible. But what we're going to find is signs that life existed. But eventually we might find subsurface, and that's why it's really interesting. Martian surface is so harsh in most planetary bodies. So that is why we often go subsurfaces. If we're going to find some life that is still alive, it's probably going to be subsurface that we're going to bring back. But we don't want to expose it to the environment because it may or may not be able to survive in that. So this is where there is this whole field that's getting very interesting, is bringing cryo samples back. And because you want to preserve.
So this is deep freezing the elements and then bringing them back to Earth?
Collecting deep frozen elements.
Yeah.
And keeping them deep frozen. So I think that's very interesting is, you collect it, but how do you not modify the environment it was in? Because if you modified it, maybe you don't preserve that life.
Right.
And so that's fascinating. And so, that's a whole different element of creating a robot that can also collect that sample and not alter it.
And so you were saying that these scientists were really excited about something that Perseverance has already collected, and that was because the data was so correlated. So what was so correlated?
Right.
What was the data?
Right. So I think there are models that we have of seeing certain signatures that are correlated with life. And so they saw, this looks like it could be organic life. And then also visually, the patterns that they expected to see. So I think there's a high probability that it would correlate with, biosignatures that they have that match sort of similar microbial life on Earth. So they've been very excited about it.
So you've given me two really fascinating, mind-blowing things to think about. First, that we might already have collected life on Earth, and then also a machine intelligence of the future might be the first to detect alien life. So I'm going to be thinking about that all evening. So Dr. Vandi Verma, thank you so much. And I can't wait to see what your research brings. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed speaking with you.
Futurology is a Studio B and Waveland production with distribution from Realm. Our executive producers are Nicholas Berggruen, Nathan Gardells, Dawn Nakagawa, Nils Gilman, and Jason Hoke. Futurology is produced by Grant Slater, Alex Gardells, and Natalia Ramos. Our associate producer is Alyssa Mardini. Futurology's theme music was composed by Marcus Bagala. The show is mixed and mastered by Aaron Bastinelli. Special thanks to Heather Mason, Olivia De Rienzo, Carly Migliori, and Nick Goddard.